We have got two talks. The first one now is Simon Innes and Chad Page, who will be discussing the software side of the Domesday 86 project, which is the Ld Decode software, part of the software side. So I will hand over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Okay, let me just share my screen. Hopefully that should work first time. Okay, well, this is the second part. If you watched the previous ABug, I did an overview of Domesday 86, the project, and in that I mentioned about I think I used the expression rabbit hole at the time, of about 3 years of time that I've spent now working on the Ld Decode side of things, and that it was a subject all in itself. So really in this presentation, we're going to do two things. I'm joined by Chad from California, who is the other half, if you like, of the Ld Decode, the originator of Ld Decode. And I'm going to give a kind of semi-technical overview of the Ld Decode project and what we're doing. And then I'm going to hand over to Chad, who's going to give an actual live demonstration of the software decoding disks. And to start with, I mean, let me just, if I can change slides, there we go. So there's a couple of things really. If you want to understand software decoding, there's a couple of things you need to understand before you can even do anything with it. One is the encoding of disks. How were they mastered in the first place? You have to understand what it is you're attempting to decode, and that means understanding how it was actually put together. And the other thing is you have to understand a little bit about how Laserdisc players actually function, how they work, and what it is that Ld Decode is attempting to emulate in a way. It has to be able to take an RF copy of the disc and play it like it was a real player. And everything else is just maths, basically. There's an awful lot of maths involved in this, and that's really Chad's domain rather than mine. I'm going to put the pressure on him on that one. But you know, it really is that. Once you understand what it is you're trying to do, it's a case of implementing mathematics to take what you've got and turn it into what you want. So for the purpose of this, because this is an ABug, we're going to use as much as possible images from the original Domesday discs. So all of the Laserdisc examples that you're going to see in this presentation are from Ld Decode, and they are unpost-processed images, so they're direct from the discs, processed through Ld Decode. So hopefully you'll get a bit of a feel for the quality of the software itself. The first thing to say before jumping into it is that this Laserdiscs are not a digital system. We're talking about analog television color systems here. It's not even a video effectively that's recorded on these discs. You have two different standards basically. NTSC, never twice the same color, which is the American standard, and PAL, Pretty and Lovely, which was the standard we used in Europe. Now, of course, really what happens between these two standards is that there are advantages and disadvantages of both of them. But the important things to realize is that it's not like an MP4 file. It's not a series of JPEGs playing very fast one after the other. In fact, there isn't even any frames. Everything is what's called field-based. And there are two fields that form the frames that you see on the TV. But on these discs, you don't even have the benefit of having ready-made frames. You even have to assemble that. And it's an amplitude modulated standard. And I'll show you what this looks like just to give you kind of an idea of the feel for the signals that are involved. But as I say, it's a little, the more you dig into it, the more you understand that this is quite a complicated beast to try to decode. It's not a simple video stream that we're talking about. So we're going to be talking primarily about PAL laser vision, as Philips called it. It had different names, DiscoVision, Laser Active, LV-ROM, but they're all basically the same standards. LaserVision was European from Philips, and then there was DiscoVision from MCA, I believe it was. And there's different names for it, but there really is only two standards, the NTSC standard discs and the PAL standard discs. And because I'm talking mainly about Domesday, the focus is going to be on PAL. But really NTSC is pretty much the same, it just has a little bit different mathematics. So first of all, to actually look at what's really on the disc, a lot of people think laser discs are very similar to CDs, and in a way they are, but what's recorded on the disc is not digital, it's analog information. And It's a spiral track from the center of the disk to the outside of the disk, and the pits are 0.4, what do we call them, microns wide. To give you an idea of how wide that is, I think a human hair is about 75 microns. So we're talking about some pretty microscopic things on the surface. And the depth of those pits is 0.1 microns. And the tracks in this spiral, they're pretty close together, 1.6 to 1.8 microns apart. It varies across the disk. So if you look at a 30 centimeter disk in diameter, then you're talking about 34 kilometers, 21 miles of track, which is why when we start talking about decodes and we go into like these huge figures for, you know, 1/4 of a terabyte per side, it's because we're taking a high resolution image of 21 miles of track when we do this, every side of a disk. So Domesday, which is 2 disks, 4 sides, and you're talking like 100 miles of information if you want to put it into that sort of term. And it's very, very small. I mean, you have trouble seeing it even with a microscope. So how are the disks actually made up? So the way the disks are constructed is that you actually have 2 separate disks that are manufactured. You basically take 2 thin disks, you press the pits into the disk in a clean room environment, you coat the inside of the disk with aluminium, and then you put those 2 disks together to form the double-sided Laserdisc. So you end up with something that looks like this diagram. And the beauty of this system is a bit like CDs, that you actually have a very large amount of plastic, 1.1 millimeters of plastic, between the surface of the disk and the actual information that you're looking at. So one of the really smart things about optical media, especially with Laserdiscs, is that you can make the light beam, the laser, focus through the plastic. And when you do that, it becomes a lot less susceptible to surface damage, to scuffs and scratches and those sorts of things. And this is pretty much how DVDs work and Blu-ray discs still work today. So I mentioned about this idea of analog information being recorded. So you don't actually have a video signal. There's quite a lot of different things that are encoded onto a Laserdisc. And I'll kind of go into what these different things are in a moment. But at a simple level, you take the video signal, which is modulated onto a carrier, looks a bit like this. You take a audio and a data signal, which is also modulated onto a carrier. You sum the 2 signals together, and then you limit them. And these negative half periods of the sine waves are what become the pits in the disk. So therefore, the positive half periods are the gaps between those pits. So when you shine a laser at the disk and you spin the disk underneath, what actually comes out the back of the laser is a sine wave. The sine wave is recreated by the laser passing through and in and out of these pits. So when you actually look at an RF signal that's coming off a laser disc, you actually get a sine wave back. It's not even a digital signal just because of these pits and troughs. Because at that sort of microscopic level, the troughs themselves are actually smooth. They're curves. They're not, you know, rectangular dips. So it's quite a clever system of recreating this signal. By taking this and encoding it in this way, you're actually making the laser output the sine wave that you originally mastered onto the disk. But that sine wave isn't video. It's a frequency modulated combination of different things. So to look at how that actually works, when you have an optical media, you have a certain frequency that you can encode onto the disk. And the more accurate the media, the wider the range of frequencies you can represent. So when you look at the PAL signal spectra, that's actually, it's around about 7-8 megahertz is where the signal is. And of course, because it's frequency modulated, the video signal is going up and down in frequency as you're recording it. So it's across a range. And you also have side bands and harmonics and all sorts of things going on in the spectra. So the video uses most of the bandwidth of the disk. And actually in PAL, you can either have 2 audio channels, 2 analog audio channels, or you can have EFM, which is a digital channel. It's what Domesday uses to record the digital data. NTSC is a little bit different because NTSC the video uses less bandwidth. So in NTSC, you can actually have analog audio and EFM and video all on the same disk at the same time. So there are little differences to do with the television standards. There's also 2 different methods to store RF on the disk. The first one is called constant angular velocity, CAV. This is where you rotate the disk at a constant speed. So if you think about this, it's a bit like floppy disks. You have a lot more disk on the outside of the disk than you have on the inside of the disk. So it's less efficient from a kind of compactness of the storage to do it at CAV. Because at CAV, you have 2 fields on each rotation of the disk, and it's two fields all the way through the disk, whether you're on the outside or the inside. So you get less playing time. It's about 36 minutes. But the advantage of that is that it's quite a simple analog thing to spin the disk through one rotation and then pull the head back one track so that you continue to play the same two fields over and over again. And when you do that, you get a perfect still frame. And it's that trick that caused Laserdisc to become the sort of de facto standard in the mid-80s for interactive video systems. Because not only could you move very quickly to a particular point on the disc, but you could continue to play the same frame or the same series of frames. So it was possible to do still frames, slow motion. You could play forwards, you could play backwards, which not even modern video systems are very good at. So it was a very flexible random access way, and you could actually have 54,000 still frames on a single disc. So even if you compare it to early CDs, when you had, even with JPEG compression, Laserdiscs were actually a lot better at storing images because you didn't have to compress anything. It was already analog. But there's also a standard called constant linear velocity as well. So in this one, you change the speed that you rotate the disc at. So really what you're doing here is that the length of the track length for every frame is constant no matter where you are on the disc. So on the outside where you have the wider diameter, you're able to get more frames in that space of the disc, and it gets less and less towards the center. So basically, it gives you about 60 minutes playing time, funnily enough. That was what they were aiming for. But the difference with that is that a real Laserdisc player can only play it back in a linear fashion. You can't hop back a track because you really don't know where you're hopping back to. So when you look at the information actually on a disc, they're made up of three different areas. What's called the lead-in and the lead-out. The lead-in is the thing that guides the pickup head to the start of the program. So you need something in this analog system that you can lock onto, and then it basically spins it down and puts the optical pickup at the right place to start playing the movie or whatever content is on the disc. And similarly, the lead-out tells the player that the disc is done and it's time to stop or go back and play again. In the middle of that, you have the program area, which is the CAV or the CLV bit, which is the actual content itself. And I mentioned earlier on that these aren't frames, these are fields. So if you have a CAV disc, then the picture number, there's information about the picture number and the frame number and a few other things on the disc. But the picture number is always in the first field. So it uses a trick to allow the player to know when you hit the pause button to still frame, which field to play first and which field to play second. And you can see in this little diagram here, it's quite a simple thing. You interpolate the two fields together, and that provides you with the frame. If you still frame on the wrong thing, if you imagine you have two pictures next to each other, you'll actually get half of one picture and half of the other picture, which is why the field order is kind of important. One of the problems with CLV is that because a television plays by showing one field, then showing the next field, and then it shows the next field, then it shows the next field, the order of the frame isn't important on a standard television, on an analog television. So in CLV, it doesn't actually tell you what field order the field should be in. You have to guess. There is kind of a standard, but every other Laserdisc breaks it. So these are some of the problems that you're dealing with when you're looking at Laserdiscs. They were never meant to be digitized. And when you're looking at the information on the discs themselves, it's field-based. And it's quite an important thing to understand when you're playing with the decoding, understanding how the software decoder actually functions. So when you do an RF copy, and I have a section in a moment to talk about how the RF copying actually functions, but we use a real Laserdisc player. I mentioned this in the other presentation. And we use a real Laserdisc player because what we're doing is we're taking the laser output from it and sampling that. But for that to actually work, you need to have a well-calibrated player, and I've mentioned that a few times in the past. And the reason for that is that there's quite a lot of mechanical things that have to go right to be able to get a good signal from the laser itself. And all of this happens in what's called the optical deck. And the optical deck it's a few different things. It's the laser itself, the pickup. It's what's called the slide drive that moves the laser forward and backwards under the disc. It's the spindle motor itself, which has to rotate the disc at the correct speed. And there's actually a thing called active tilt control as well. So if you've ever heard someone complaining about their Domesday player, one of these things is usually the thing that's broken in it. The tilt is quite a common fault in the VP415s. So what it's actually doing is that if you think about a 30-centimeter laser disc, it's quite a big thing. It's like a couple of millimeters thick, and it weighs a good few hundred grams. So when you hold it in the center of the disc actually bends like an umbrella under its own weight, even when you're spinning it. So one of the problems is you can move the laser underneath the disc itself, but because the disk is curving over and you've got such tight tolerances, you actually have to be able to tilt the laser to compensate for the umbrella shape of the disk itself. And that's something called active tilt control. You also have, within the laser pickup itself, the focus. So this diagram over here on the side shows a very kind of simple view of what a pickup looks like. And you have a thing called a semi-transparent mirror. So you have a grating which splits the laser up into 3 parts, and I'll tell you what that's for in a second. You then have a semi-transparent mirror that bounces it up onto the disk and allows the light back from the disk to come back through this semi-transparent mirror onto a series of photodiodes. And they're usually in a quadrature like this, A, B, C, and D. So what's actually happening is if the depth of focus is 1.5 microns, which is very small, and you've got a disk that's kind of bouncing up and down and spinning around at several thousand RPM, you need a very fast focusing system to keep the laser on track. And this is actually what it's doing. It works by simply looking at the output of these different quadratures, and it can work out whether the disk is too far away, whether it's too close, or whether it's in focus. And it has to move very, very quickly to be able to do this and do it very accurately. So the calibration of focus is a really important thing. You also have a thing called radial tracking. So you've got 34 kilometers of this spiral around the disk, and you have to be able to keep the laser pointing on the track at all times to a 0.1 micron accuracy. And what happens if you drift off the track is that you actually pick up the tracks on either side, and you get an effect called crosstalk, where you see a different picture bleeding into the picture that you're seeing. Quite often it just comes through as noise. So again, if you're trying to get an accurate preservation copy of something, all of this has to be totally minimized. And the way a player does that is by using a thing called a grating. And the grating takes the single beam that's coming from the laser and splits it into 3 parts. The central part, which is being used to read the disk, and then you have 2 auxiliary beams, which you can then use to do some simple mathematics to work out whether you're actually on the central track of, on the radial track or not. And again, just as the focus is bouncing up and down, there's coils that are controlling the actual position of the laser inside the player, constantly allowing for the amount of wobble. And the mechanical wobble of such a heavy disk is huge. There's 130 microns, which if you consider that you're trying to achieve a 0.1 micron accuracy is massive. So the fact that these Laserdisc players worked in the 1970s is kind of it's a tribute to the engineering of the time. It really is a very cool piece of technology. But it's also why more modern players are so much better at this than the original players like the VP415, and the reason why in the project we tend to use much more capable newer players, because the electronics are simply better and the reaction to all of this is much faster in the player. So with all of this, the same quadrature is used to actually get the RF output. So what we're really sampling is exactly the same signal. If you take A, B, C, and D and you add them together, you get the output from the laser. It's the sum of those 4 quadrants. So the same photo center is being used for focusing, it's being used for radial tracking, and then it's outputting the RF, and it's the RF that we actually want. So there's quite a lot in the player that has to be set up correctly. And of course, a 30-year-old player will drift quite a lot over its lifetime. So it's quite important to understand how we actually go about calibrating these to get a good RF signal and what a good RF signal is. So once you've got that RF signal, you then have another problem, that this is analog and it's fast. I mean, we're talking about, it's around about 10 megahertz of bandwidth. Actually, it's around about 8 or 9. But we say about 10, and we want to go a bit over that 20 megahertz of bandwidth so that we don't get too much windowing. That means you need, Nyquist, it means that you need about 40 million samples per second. And that's a lot. It's not that you need to do it just like an oscilloscope does with a little burst of sampling. You need to be able to do this constantly without losing a single bit of data over 1 hour, because that's the size of, the length of one side of a disk. So this in itself is actually quite a complicated problem, because even modern computers, even though they're very, very fast, they are not real-time computing devices. What happens when you try to sample this speed using a standard PC is that halfway through the side of the disk, your PC decides to go off and scan a drive, or you decide to open a web browser, and it moves its focus away from this process somewhere else, and you suddenly start losing data. So actually, to get this type of sampling rate, you have to have several different things. We have the Laserdisc player itself. There's an RF front end, which is the thing that treats the signal ready to be sampled. There's the sampling, and then there's an FPGA, and the FPGA is used to act as a very, very high speed buffer. So we use it basically to soak up the tiny delays that are happening as your PC decides to go and do other things, because the bandwidth over the USB isn't guaranteed. And then we have to use USB 3 to get that bandwidth and then get that to a PC. And I showed this picture last time, but this is what the Domesday duplicator looks like. This is the duplicator board itself. The board underneath is a D0 Nano, an FPGA board, and the board on top is the USB 3 transceiver. And we just stack these up to make it as simple as possible. On the PC side of things, you need a lot of speed to take this data and successfully store it. So pretty much if you have a spinning platter disk, it won't work. You need an SSD just to get the throughput. And what's happening is the USB 3 is being handled by a whole ton of threads. So we're trying to soak up as much CPU resource as possible when we're sampling. And then that goes into several disk buffers. Those disk buffers are then written out by a thread because they have to go sequentially to the drive. And then we write that to an SSD. And we have to basically get this to a point where mathematically it is very, very, very likely to succeed. With a standard general purpose computer, you can never guarantee this. But this at the moment, we've tested it up to about 75 million samples per second, and it works fine. But there's an awful lot of software and hardware tech going on to actually sample the RF coming off the laser at the right speed. And then if you actually look at the Domesday duplicator board itself, it's a pretty simple RF path. In comes the signal from the laser itself. That goes through a preamp, which treats it and gets it ready to be sampled. There's then a filter, which is an anti-aliasing filter. I'll show that in a second. Into the ADC, and then these are just line buffers that then feed it into the FPGA. And the rest of it is then off-the-shelf hardware that we're using. But the great thing about this is that it's a 10-bit ADC, so it has a good sensitivity range, 40 million samples per second, which is huge. It's extremely low noise. It has a completely configurable preamp, so these switches that you see on it allow you to configure the board for completely different Laserdisc players. So it works. We haven't found a Laserdisc player it doesn't work with yet. So, you know, the laser RF is not always at the same level. This actually allows you to set the preamplification stage to whatever Laserdisc player you have. And this whole board costs around 50 euros, which is nothing for this type of application. You also then have the problem of filtration as well. I mean, you know, there's a lot of questions. Quite often people ask me, why aren't we using software-defined radio? Why aren't we using this off-the-shelf board? Apart from the problem of speed and noise, the other problem that you have is filtration. You have to filter the signal quite carefully so that you don't get aliasing in the ADC, because if you exceed the bandwidth of your ADC, what happens is the signal actually reflects back as noise into the thing you're trying to sample. So there is a very carefully designed filter on board the Domesday duplicator that filters just the right amount of signal. And this is something that we developed, and then Chad and I did lots and lots of testing to make sure that we really did get what we expected, and it works properly with Laserdiscs, both NTSC and PAL. So this stage is kind of special to this particular board, just for doing Laserdisc. So what it looks like, this is just an RF sample that's been taken off and then shown in, I think this is a Adobe Audition, but it works quite as well in Audacity. You have a resolution. I mentioned earlier on, this is an FM, it's frequently multiplexed. So the way to think about this really is the signal is kind of turned on its side. So the 40 million samples per second allows you to see 20 megahertz of bandwidth, 20 megahertz frequency. And that's actually the resolution of the thing you're looking at. The 10 bits in the other direction is amplitude. And the amplitude in this case is really just sensitivity. At the start of a disk, the signal is quieter than it is at the end of a disk because of something called a media transfer function. It's just a physics principle that happens with optical media. So the sensitivity just has to be enough that you can capture across an entire disk with that variance in amplitude. But the 10 bits, it doesn't need to be 16 bits or 24 bits or 32 bits. All that happens then is you can see more amplitude, but it's the frequency that actually gives you the data in this particular case with an FM signal, which is why we have a lot more in the sample resolution than we have in the actual ADC resolution. It's again just to do with the mathematics of what's going on. We also have another problem that I talk about an awful lot when we're talking about Domesday discs, especially a thing that people call laser rot. And laser rot is to do with the fact that if you look at a Domesday disc, it's not all laser discs, but pretty much every Domesday disc that was pressed by Philips PDO UK, which is pretty much the worst pressing house in the universe when it came to laser discs. That's where all the Domesday discs come from. And what happens is that there's, I mentioned earlier on about the way we clamp these two discs together, and we put a little bit of aluminium in there, and we put some adhesive to hold those two discs together to make the laser disc. The adhesive breaks down over time, and in fact, some discs have faulty adhesive that had a little bit of water in it, and the adhesive turns alkaline and just eats straight through the aluminium layer, and that's what we call rot, or laser rot it's called. And sometimes it's called cloud rot and edge rot and a few other things, but really it's all to do with breakdown of adhesive in the discs. And this is something that Domesday discs are really suffering from a lot. The other problem you have is a thing called edge delamination, which is where at the edge of the discs, because those are the ones that get like a little bit of impact damage and they're exposed to the air, the plastic at the edge of the disc starts to delaminate, it starts to split apart. And that allows air into the disc, which allows the adhesive to break down again and causes further rot. And you have both of these happening at the same time, and it can change a disc from perfectly good to you can barely notice any problems to you just can't play it anymore. So for this presentation, what I did was I took my microscope and I actually grabbed a Domesday National disc and tried to show these conditions. So these are from Domesday National discs themselves. The one on the right here is edge delamination. So this is a very small, you're looking at like a millimeter of the disc here, but you can see what's happened is that as the edge is delaminated, gradually it's cracking through and through the disc. Eventually this delamination, you can see the shadowing that it's causing, will come through this part here, another millimeter or so, and the edge of the disc starts to be unreadable. The one that affects most discs is this kind of cloud rot, and here you can see in the outside of the disc this spotting. So if I just zoom in a little bit more, you can actually see here the aluminium being completely destroyed. And these are very, very small small things on the disc, but each one of these tiny lines is a collection of tracks. So you're looking at something that is really small. Actually, this is VBI information, data on the disc. But you can see here that each one of these is a line of the television picture that's being produced, a line of the field. So this is actually quite a chunk of the line that's disappeared. Here you have over several frames, you've lost information. And this is typical of a national disc, typical of a community disc. And the reason why, when I talk about the timeliness of backing up these discs and the fact that in 5-10 years time they won't play anymore, it's this effect that's causing that. So that's the discs, the laser part of it, and how we're actually copying that laser stuff. But now we actually jump into Ld Decode. So by the time we get to this point, we actually have an RF image of the disc itself. So we've taken the optical disc and we've produced an analog digitization, if you like, a digital version of the analog information. And the idea is to have it at such a high resolution that we've exceeded the resolution at which it was they were capable of mastering these discs at. So we can't lose anything effectively in that translation. But now we actually have an RF copy. We have the same problem that a normal Laserdisc player has, that we can't just, you know, throw up a television picture and say, hey, look, it's a Domesday frame. We actually have to play the disc just like a real Laserdisc player would. So this is a typical Laserdisc player after the laser bit. There's actually quite a lot going on. There's the HF processing or the RF processing in the front end. There's a thing called Dropout Correction. There's a thing called TBC. And this is video processing, which can turn into RGB, which then goes to the video out. There's the analog audio processing. There's EFM processing, and that can be digital audio and digital data. And I'll go in a little bit of detail about what these different things are doing. But suffice to say that you have to split up what is on the disk. That's the first thing. So you have this modulated signal that's coming in, and the first thing you have to do is break those signals up. So typically you'll break it up into a video signal, you'll break it up into an analog audio signal, and you'll break it up into some form of data. And that may be digital data, or it may be digital sound actually, but it's all data at this point. So, and this is the same for PAL as it is for NTSC. The only thing that's changed is that the maths are a little bit different. So we're taking that frequency modulated signal, and then with a lot of accuracy, you want to split that up. And of course, you don't want any of those signals to be interfering with each other. So this is one thing that Ld Decode is very good at, because we use, well, Chad, I should say, uses FFT to do this. So we get very efficient filters. They're far more efficient and a lot less low noise than the analog filters that a traditional player would have. So now you've actually got video, you've got audio, and you've got data, but that's still not enough. Then what you have to do is you actually have to do a thing called time-based correction. So there's a lot of jitter going on as the disc spins. It's not a perfect spinning mechanism. So what happens is each video line is getting stretched and compressed as the disc speed changes. And that gives you this wonderful wobbly signal where you can't see anything. So there is a problem within this decoding where you actually have to lock on to some kind of time base inside the signal and try to correct all of that back out. And the better the correction you can do, the more accurate reproduction of the original signal you get back. You also have problems to do with dropout correction. Lasers are not perfect, discs aren't perfect. Sometimes you lose the signal, and the dropout correction is what you do when a signal is lost, how you go about replacing it or hiding that. You also, in this, you can see you get this thing called a CVBS video out. So this is a kind of traditional analog video signal. And quite often you want to turn that into something nice and colorful. And this signal itself is actually a black and white. It's a grayscale signal, and I'll show you a bit about what it looks like in a moment. But a chroma decoder is the part that then turns that into a color picture. And the chroma decoder, or comb filter as it's called in the NTSC world, is an incredibly complicated mathematical thing to do this trick. And we have a lot of tricks in Ld Decode to some of the best chroma decoders that there are on the planet per se, especially on the PAL side, to be able to do this, to reproduce the color and get rid of all of the noise. So looking at each one of these in a little bit more detail, starting with the video. So the video isn't just actually video. Within the video itself, you're getting full bandwidth PAL or NTSC, which is one of the beautiful things about Laserdisc, is that the television picture is actually full bandwidth, which is not on VHS, for example. So you have really good quality video image. But there's also a thing called the vertical interval control and address signals, bit of a mouthful. But this is, we often call it VBI data. This is actually things like, this is frame number 21, and the sound is analog, and there's all this different information encoded into each one of these fields. And it's what's called a 24-bit biphase coded signal. Lovely expression for it. But that's actually coded into every single field has this VBI data at the top of it. If it's NTSC, there's also a 40-bit FM coded signal, which gives you more information about what's going on. There are things called VITs, the vertical interval test signals, that are in each one of these fields as well. NTSC has a thing called first field white flag. You can even have things like teletext and closed captioning, all in this video field. So you don't just have video in the video, it's video plus. It's an awful lot of other information. So this is one of the things that's interesting to understand when people start talking about the difference between RF capture and RGB capture. When you do RGB capture with like a standard video capture device, what you get is the video, but you don't get any of this other stuff. It's all lost effectively. So to look at what that looks like here, this is actually a frame from Domesday, the BBC Test Card F, which I think is, it's like frame 1500 on the disc. And you can see here in our analysis tool, this is actually part of Ld Decode. I've selected a particular line, and then in the tool, I can actually bring up what that line looks like. So if you look at the analog nature of this line, you can see here that it goes up and down, white and black, white and black. Then we have white, a section of black, a section of white, it's mirrored on the other side. And you look at that in the analog signal, you can actually see how that line is formed in the PAL signal itself. So this is black and white. There is only luminosity, it's just luma signal that's in here. But there's quite a lot of other stuff going on here as well, like these bits, for example. So when you actually look at what's going on here, you have a few things. You have 0 IRE, which is the black level, and 100 IRE. These are just arbitrary levels that tell you this is a black signal, this is a white signal. It's just pure luma information. The reason why these aren't straight lines is because this is an analog medium. It's coming off a noisy Domesday disc. So there is white level noise and there is black level noise. And the amount of noise you get at those 2 points gives us a good idea of the quality of the disc. But there's also a thing here called a color burst, and I'll talk about that in a minute to do with the color decoding. And there's a thing called the H-sync and pilot burst as well. So when I was talking about the time-based correction, one of the things that you need to be able to do is to do time-based correction, you have to lock on to where the beginning of the line is. And that's what this horizontal sync is for. So you can actually see this a little bit close up. This isn't actually standard PAL. It has an extra bit in it that helps us to get a bit better lock on this particular line. But we have to lock on to the 50% point of this burst to know when exactly the line starts. And given the noisy environment that's going on, the true analog nature of this, locking onto that 50% point is really quite a difficult trick. And to give you an idea of what this looks like, I had Chad produce me an image from Domesday and turn off the time-based correction. So this image is what happens if you don't have any time-based correction. It's the accuracy of the playing disc itself. And you can see that's not a very straight image, to say the least. And then when the TBC is turned back on again, you get this beautifully straight and accurate image. And actually, the TBC is probably one of the most understated parts of the Ld Decode tool chain. It really is the best of the best. If you don't get this right, you don't get anything. You have lousy resolution and a lousy picture. All your colors messed up. Nothing looks good if the TBC is incorrect. So the nice thing about Ld Decode is it's not just able to do this for very good discs, it can do this for really bad discs. We have thrown the most unbelievably badly destroyed discs at it. And if the TBC can actually get hold of the field, it will straighten it up and it will produce a picture from it. But then you also have on top of that the problem of chrominance as well. So before, what I showed you in this picture was just luminance, but here I've actually moved a little bit and we're showing a line across the top here with different colors, starting with white, ending with white, and having a few colors in between. And then you can actually use the tools to show that. So what happens is that each one of these lumens, there is a luminance that shows how bright this is. And then what happens is that the color is modulated onto that luma signal. And the phase of that tells the comb filter what color it is that's trying to be reproduced. And the only way to work out the phase is to have you have to know where the zero phase is, and then you rotate the sine wave around basically to get the different phases. And that's what this little color burst does. So the color burst tells the chroma decoder what the zero phase looks like. And then this is used as a reference to then decode the different colors to produce this nice color image you see down here. And of course, you can see in here the amount of noise that's going on. These should be just straight lines, like little rectangles, but there's a lot of noise in these environments, perfectly natural. So one of the things that Ld Decode is constantly fighting against is the amount of noise that's in the signal. And if on a normal player, if you have a dropout that happens during this color burst, the chroma decoder in the player will completely lose the plot. It won't, the whole frame will just go black and white. But of course, using software decoding, what we can do is if we can't get a good color burst from this field, we can take it from the next one or the previous one. So we're actually able to do some pretty clever processing tricks that make the decoding process much, much better at dealing with damaged disks. And that's kind of cool because pretty much everything to do with Domesday is a damaged disk. So this is really where we get to fly with the quality we can produce. We can even, using the white and the black noise levels, do analysis of what discs look like. So this is actually a disc, and we can see here what the signal to noise ratio is from the start of the disc to the end of the disc. So when you do a capture and then you decode that capture, we can actually use Ld Decode to tell us what the quality of the disc is overall. So we can compare mathematically one disc to another disc. We also use this with test discs. You can still buy calibration discs from Pioneer, for example. If you put the same calibration disc in two players, you can mathematically compare the performance of both players. So you can see how good the calibration and how good the mechanics are in the players and the optics. So I mentioned quickly about these VBI information. There's a lot of data basically in here, and the tools also allow you to extract that out. And this is what it looks like from the tools. So again, a picture from Domesday. You can see here across the top is one of the VBI lines, which looks like this on the oscilloscope. And then this is LD Analyze, and Chad will show you that working. It will actually then pull that out and it will decode all of this information live for you and tell you what the disk is telling you. And it understands different standards and the different amendments of the specs and all sorts of clever things. Again, much more than a player could ever do. We also have the ability to look at the VITs, and these VITs really are, you can see them up here. It's difficult to see in these lines, but some of these are actually VIT signals. They look like this. They enable us to actually field by field measure the performance of the player. So they were originally inserted into the PAL and NTSC standards to act as a test tool. Any engineer that was testing a player could, pull up any field and he would see these things. But one of the things we're able to do in software decoding is that because these are present in pretty much every field on the disk, we can actually measure the performance of the playback field by field as we go through the whole disk. But remember, we're talking about 54,000 frames, so it's 100,000 fields we're talking about. And that means we can actually look at the test signals and dynamically change the way that we're decoding each individual field to get more accuracy. So if there is something that happens to the disk to cause the luminosity to drop, for example, you have a drop in amplitude, we're able to look at the VITs and then compensate for that, which is something, again, no analog player could ever do. And it enables us to do some fantastic tricks that just aren't possible with real players. Again, with dropout detection, this is what a dropout looks like. You have a lovely frequency and then boom, suddenly there's a scratch that the laser bounces off into space and you lose signal. And this is a typical thing. You see these little black lines appearing on the pictures. And you can even see this by then pulling that up. The system is able to actually analyze and look for these dropouts. So again, we can correct for dropouts only if we see them. So there are multiple mechanisms within Ld Decode to look for these dropout events. And any dropout events that we see, we can then do something to correct. In fact, we can also use this as a quality analysis of the disk as well. We can see across this Domesday disk, for example, how many dropouts averaged over a certain number of fields we're seeing. So you can actually get from the SNR and from the dropout analysis, you get a really good feel for what condition the disk is in. But there's a really clever trick that we're doing now with Ld Decode, and that's a thing called differential dropout detection. And differential dropout detection allows you to take RF samples of the same disk. So if I take, for example, 3 copies of the national disk, different copies, and I make an RF sample of them, I can use differential comparison between those to look for what is a dropout event. So if I see an error on one disk, I can compare it to the other 2 disks. If 2 disks match, then it's an error. If only one disk matches, sorry, if 2 disks matches, then it's correct. If it's only one, then it's local to this disk. So I know that it's a dropout. And this enables you to actually spot pretty much every error in the picture. So you're able to, using differential dropout detection, find a lot of pretty much every single dropout that's on the disk, which again, a normal player couldn't do. And if you can find them, you can then map them and correct them. So to give an idea of what this looks like, this is just a single disk source. This is the MIT Aspen movie map, one of the rarest disks we've managed to sample. And you can see here, this is the undropout corrected version. It's in pretty damn poor shape. And that's pretty much what a normal player would look like. It really wouldn't have much chance of correcting such noise. But this, from a single disk correction, the system is actually able to pull back a pretty good looking picture from it. Considering this is like one of the earliest IV laser discs that we've managed to sample, you can actually see what's going on here. And the other thing with dropout correction is that here, when you have a single disk source, this isn't correction actually, this is concealment. What we're doing is we're using very clever algorithms that say, I have a bit of the video missing. It will then hunt around that piece, trying to find a piece of the video line nearest to it that it can pull out and replace that dropout from to hide it or conceal it in the best way. And it's very, very clever in the fact that it will actually know if it won't copy another dropout onto a dropout, which a player would do. So it's actually able to get a pretty good picture back even from a single disk source. If you have multiple disks, we're able to do multiple correction. We're actually able to say, there is a hole in my video here. Go over to that disk where I know the signal is good from the differential comparison I did, and pull the video line from there and actually put that data back. And in that case, we're not concealing, we're correcting. We're actually taking the original data and putting it back where it should be. So we can recreate the picture. And the more disks we have, the closer we can get the video signal back to what the original master looked like. So you can actually add information in. So Ld Decode is capable of producing an output that is greater than a single Laserdisc. It's actually the sum of the parts that we're sampling, which is a kind of an exciting area. It's something we're starting to develop now more and more. I wanted to say a quick thing about aspect ratio, because there's always someone that mentions aspect ratio to me, and that we should call the aspect ratio police. You might have noticed that these images you're seeing off Domesday are not 4:3, but that's actually because PAL, just like NTSC, doesn't have square pixels. So this analysis tool that Chad will be showing you is actually what's sampled from the disk in its original unprocessed resolution. If you actually want to get it in 4:3, that's actually a post-process that you have to do to the signal. There's a few other things as well. Analog audio, and I'm not going to labor on these too much. The nice thing about Laserdisc is it actually has independent mono channels, so you can have bilingual discs. It also has a thing called CX audio compression, like an equalization that can be applied to it. But the downside with analog audio is that PAL disc can't have it and EFM at the same time. So the Domesday disc do actually have a little bit of analog audio in the intro, but that's the only analog audio there is on the whole disc. The rest of it is all EFM data. And the data itself is in a format that Philips was developing originally for CDs. So again, unlike a CD, it doesn't have digital information stored on the optical media itself. There's actually a sine wave signal that is present. And it's the periods of these sine wave signals that tell us what T value there is, T3 to T11 are the values. And that's how we pull the binary information from these sinusoidal signals. So quite often when you hear about EFM, you'll see these nice eye diagrams going on. So from these eye diagrams, because this period is known, you can recover the clock, then you can PLL lock onto that signal and you can pull back the EFM information. And the EFM is a data stream. It's 8 to 14 modulation, it's called. And the reason why it's used is actually to do with CDs. The idea is that because what's on the optical media of a CD is binary data, you can't have too many zeros. Because if you have too many zeros, there's nothing for the radial tracking of the laser to lock onto to follow the track. So you have to have constantly changing data all the time. And EFM was actually made to ensure that there is always something for the laser to follow. And that's the reason, the history behind the EFM. And Philips just happened to have developed it for CDs at the time, and they put that chip into the VP415 when they produced it. That then decodes down into a binary stream that contains it contains frames, and each one of those frames contains a lot of other things like error correction. That for the same reason, when you have like a CD, you can scratch it and it still plays fine. Exactly the same is true of LDs. It's quite resilient to data corruption. And really, it either comes down to 2 channels of 44.1 kilohertz audio, or there is another framing level which then goes through many more correction levels that then give you the actual data itself, which is why, just like CDs, Laserdiscs have far less capacity for data than they do for audio. Because in audio, if you lose a little bit and you have to conceal it, it's not a big issue. But with Laserdisc, with data, the digital data, like the VFS information on the Laserdisc, it's really important that you don't lose any data. So there's a lot more error correction in there. So before I hand over to Chad, just a couple of quick extra things. One is, I always get asked this, is Ld Decode better than Rgb Capture? And to me, this is a silly question because they have nothing to do with each other. When you do an RF level preservation of a disk, you're actually preserving the contents, the optical contents of a laser disc. And Rgb Capture doesn't do that. You're comparing chalk and cheese. But if you were to actually compare the output, I would say, I mean, it's really kind of an individual thing, but Ld Decode does a better job. If the disk is really good, they're quite close together. The worse the disk gets, the better Ld Decode becomes. It becomes much better at recovering bad, noisy information from the disk. So it's excellent on excellent disks. It gets better and better as the disk condition gets worse, which sounds kind of strange. But the worse the disk is, the more advantage you get in quality terms by using Ld Decode. So, and the other thing to remember is that Ld Decode can work with multiple disk sources, which means you can correct, not conceal. And that we can do at the field level. So it's a lot more advanced than just stacking frames up. So is Ld Decode a preservation tool? I would say no, but it is. You don't need it. The preserved copy of a Domesday disc is the RF copy that we make. But the problem with that is you need to be able to test that you have a good copy. You need to prove that you've got something that's preservation level. And that's something that Ld Decode is very important for, so that we can copy a disk, we can then decode it and prove that we have a good copy of it. But the RF sample itself is the actual preserved copy. Ld Decode has nothing to do with preserving the disk per se. And one of the big advantages of Ld Decode is that you can decode thousands of times. It just gets better and better. The more software we add into Ld Decode, you're always using the same copy of the disk that never wears out, but the result that you get from it becomes better and better over time. So Chad's going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but I would say that the Ld Decode is not just one thing, it's actually a powerful tool chain. First of all, it's GPL v3, just like the rest of the Domesday 86 project. Everything is open source, everything can be used for whatever purpose people like, and that's why this is being used in things like VHS. But it is a combination of the signal processing magic itself. We have GUI analysis tools that now will enable you to look at disks. We have EFM processing tools that can process EFM from Laserdisc. It can also process the EFM from CDs. We have disk mapping alignment tools, differential dropout detection tools, dropout correction tools, and chroma decoders, so like the PAL transform decoder that you can use in many different things as well. So it is a huge piece of software that does many, many different things. And now what I'm going to do, hopefully, is hand over to Chad, if you're still listening to me, Chad, and
yeah,
you can show some of this stuff. Let me unshare my screen, and you should be able to take over from me.
Okay, screen sharing on. Here we go. So I've got my Laserdisc player plugged in the other room with a disc in it. So I'll press play and do a little capture. I probably won't do anything with what I'm actually grabbing here, but you wait. Here it goes.
So, Chad, I'm just going to interrupt you very quickly because I've been told by Daniel that I was supposed to warn people that if they want to ask questions, please do so in chat whilst Chad is talking, and then we will answer at the end.
No,
thanks.
I never introduced myself today anyway. I'm Chad. I'm a software engineer in Santa Barbara, California. I don't have any Acorn gear because, well, it's kind of hard to get here, and all the Archimedes, those batteries, man, arg. But I'm interested in a lot of little things, so this is one of them. Hopefully I'll get to play with FPGAs a bit soon. All the neural network stuff is really cool too. There's just so much stuff in so little time. But anyhow, I'm going to go back to the topic. I've captured a little bit with Ld Decode here, so now it's running the software. Now I'll capture a few frames. This is from a doctor's office disc, I think. So this has interactive segments and it's NTSC. And Adam Sampson is doing some really cool work on putting 3D filtering back in for NTSC. I'm not sure how much you can tell the difference yet, but there's 3D. 3D's a bit sharper, which is nice than 2D.
It's a bit difficult to see over Zoom, I have to say.
Yeah,
but
it is. It's kind of subtle.
It's probably worth saying there. What you were doing there, Chad, because you didn't really explain that too well, was you captured a bit of a Laserdisc and decoded it and then pulled it into an analysis tool live. So it's as simple as that.
Yeah. So after you capture it, the next thing you would do would be to, oh, wrong directory. I am having one of those days, don't mind me. Here we go. This is the LD process EFM program, which is the first phase. Well, it's actually the back end. Ld Decode does the required filtering, and it runs a subprogram that gets the EFM timing. And this program that Simon wrote does all the actual data correction, sorting, all the little dejumbling, and it knocks it down to this decode button. And at the end of the day, you get data, save sector data, and voila. See, Domesday disk.
So that's the actual VFS header information on a Domesday disk that's been pulled from a decoded image and then run through the FM decoder and then that's the VFS information that you're seeing right there. And it really
Trying
is.
to find another bit with text.
You get extra points if you find an article about sheep.
Yep, they're sheep. And then when you have a decoded disk, you can run it through LD Analyze, which Simon showed earlier, and you can kind of pan through the whole disk.
So this is Domesday National, right, Chad?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
There's the maps.
These are the surrogate walks.
Yep. And you can view things in color. And Adam Sampson ported the transform decoder that BBC Engineering, Richard Russell, who else did the transform decoder?
Jim,
Yeah.
I forgot his last name. Easterbrook, thank you.
And what I like about this is you kind of get sort of a low-end film, or it looks more like a magazine than video when you view it the right way.
I think if you pull back to one of the actual photos rather than the surrogate walks, if you
yeah.
go back a couple of thousand frames, and these photos are much clearer. You can really see the film-like aspect that these were taken from film and put into an analog media, and it's a lot clearer than a VP415 can manage. That's for sure.
Here it is zoomed in with the transform decoder, and then, although you really shouldn't see much of a difference between 2D and 3D, but you do. That's odd. Because this is a single frame. Every frame is totally different.
Yeah, for those of you that are not familiar with video standards, the 2D and 3D is a little bit odd here. 2D means that the comb filter is only acting on this individual frame. In 3D, it relies on the fact that as you have an animation of frames, you can actually get more information from looking at multiple frames. So it looks at the frame before and the frame after. That's 3D rather than 2D. So if you only have still frames like this, 2D filtering is actually better, theoretically.
Yeah.
Maths is a strange thing.
Yes, it is. So as you can see, this was a disc that Simon got new in shrink wrap. So it was surprisingly good quality for a Domesday disc. Most of the disc has very few dropouts, and then it goes through at the end. And over the next few years, it's going to get worse and worse, and the curve's going to go up and up. So it's good that we have it this way, because now it's not going to get any worse.
Yeah, so just to be clear on that, this was a shrink-wrapped, never played, never opened before Domesday disc that you're looking at here. This is the best of the best. Even though it has edge rot, it doesn't have any surface damage from being handled, so it's still a little bit better.
Yeah, so as you can see, the signal-to-noise ratio still isn't particularly great, and it's the black SNR tails off at the end here, which you would expect. And then you can also view the VBI data, and you can see if there's CX audio, which is kind of not relevant here. Teletext not present. You can get the frame number, and you can get all the information that's actually in the disk this way. And here's the line scope. It doesn't have, for me at least, the handy little line that shows up in the middle of the picture. But here's the information that has the line numbers, the VBI data you just saw. And these are the test signals that tell you a lot about how the disk amplitude is in different frequencies. Like you could do an adjustment to make this a bit better, so the disk would be a bit sharper if we adjusted for that. And then I'll go to a different disk that has many, many more dropouts, so I can show off what the dropout correction can do. As you can see, it's much higher than the other disk. Even the background is worse. And then closer to the end, it starts shooting up big time. This is the North Pole expedition, so there really aren't that many copies to capture. So you go through here, you see dropouts, but it's not too bad. Then you go further in, then you go up to near the end here, and it's like, it's snow, and it's not just the video. That's a good bad frame. So if you run it through Ld Dropout Correct, and I'll go to the same frame once it loads. As you can see, there are still dropouts, but it's greatly masked. And this will get better over time. Eventually, we'll start getting perfectionist about the dropout detection and be like, oh, it should get this, this, this. We're missing bits. So it's only going to get better. And even now it helps. I'm not sure how it looked on the regular player, but
it looked terrible. This was Dave's North Polar expedition. So Dave, if you're on this, we were talking about this earlier. This is your disk that we preserved and decoded. But if we have multiple copies of a disk, then we can actually detect all of these dropouts a lot more accurately. And this is what I meant when I was talking about the differential dropout detection. The more dropouts we see, the more accurate we can correct them, basically. But on an original player, you play this on a VP415, a lot of it just doesn't even play. It loses. There's dropouts that are happening over in the synchronization of this particular picture. And as soon as you start losing, well, you can see this here in the color burst in the sync. As soon as you start getting that, the player can lose the plot and the entire picture just flies off into outer space.
Yeah, because on PAL Laserdisc, it uses these vertical lines here for detecting, for locking into the picture, because the color burst is less normal on PAL, which is part of why it looks better. It actually has different phases, so artifacts aren't quite as noticeable. Not only that, the color bandwidth, the color burst frequency is much higher with PAL. So not only are they less noticeable, they're a lot smaller. But when you start having dropouts around here, if the player is not good at locking onto them, it could get thrown off pretty easily. And it takes, as long as the player isn't completely thrown off, Ld Decode pretty much can now recover from it.
It's very modest. It does an absolutely amazing job of locking onto awful disks and bringing them back again. It really is quite impressive, the logic that Chad's achieved in here that can see even the worst field comes back.
Thanks.
We need it for Domesday too. They're bloody awful discs.
Yeah. Well, I can show you, probably, I think I have the most bloody awful disc I have. No, I don't. I don't have that one, sorry.
I think that's okay, Chad. We can stop and take some questions. I guess there will be some. And if not, you can carry on demoing.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out what else I can demo. I don't actually have any MPV files of these discs I can play. I have samples on YouTube, but I don't think I've posted any lately.
Well, I think we can just say that on the Domesday YouTube channel, there are actually decoded discs. If you want to go and you want to see what some of the Domesday discs look like, or snippets of these different discs, you can actually go to our YouTube channel and take a look at the end results. They're from Rev 5, I think, and we're about to hit Rev 7. So I mean, it just gets better and better.
Yeah, and a lot of, especially in the US, there's a lot of like random crazy uses of Laserdiscs. Like I have this disc that I found off eBay that is basically a fake newsroom for this horrible tabloid TV show called Hard Copy. But they actually knew how Laserdiscs work. Like they kept the first 15,000 frames blank because those are the lowest quality frames. So ironically, considering how terrible the show is, it was a really well done disc. And my player isn't even the best player, and I'm getting 48 dB right on this disc. But this is something that they would play behind the news anchor, the anchor, to make it look like they were in an actual office and not a green screen. And there are people scurrying about. And often with these discs, there are only like a couple of them ever made. Like 3M had this program where you could give them $600 and they give you 2 discs. And a surprising number of people did that.
Oh, well, thank you. That was really, really interesting to actually see how the whole thing is put together and how the entire process is working and the tool chain is working, and just the results you're now getting from these appalling discs are quite astounding. There's a couple of questions have started popping up in chat now, and I've got a couple as well. So are the discs reading from the center out to the outer edge?
Correct, yes.
And that's why you're seeing the degradation more in the final frames, because they're nearer to the edge.
One of the lucky things about Domesday is that at the outer edge of each disc is a tutorial. So it was just pure luck, but they actually decided to put the help video about how to use Domesday. They put in the last few thousand frames of every side. So most of what we've lost is actually the tutorial videos, which on some discs which don't have edge delamination, we actually have pretty good copies of. Okay. So it's not the end of the world, the edge delamination at the moment. Once that gets beyond those tutorials and starts eating into the actual content, we're in more trouble. But we've already got the RF copies now, so I mean, we're already in fairly good shape.
That's cool. So a question from Phil. So for either Chad or Simon, says, are the audio error concealment algorithms in Process EFM relatively easy to reuse elsewhere? So wondering whether they could be applied to DAT.
I think that Phil is imagining that they're really clever, these concealment algorithms, but they're actually not. What it does is it looks at, like, here is a sample is missing, here is the next sample. Oh, I'll just draw a line between those two, and then it interpolates the sample in the middle. Generally, it really isn't that important. You can't hear it because it's such a fast event. So providing you're not losing a large bit of sample, then it's not really that complex. There are algorithms that draw curves between, so it will interpolate over curves, and they're a little bit more intelligent, and I have a plan to implement that at some point, but the mathematics is very well understood. I mean, every CD player on the planet does it. So it's really, it's commodity mathematics.
Right.
Yeah, well, with CDs, what you get is things are so scrambled that if you lose like 16 samples at once, even if data recovery fails, those 16 samples will be in completely different locations.
Yeah. Excellent. So a question from Walter. How did Chad get involved in the project?
It's the other way around. It was me that got involved with Chad.
Around 2013, I was just like, oh, I could use this video capture card and get the RF and bypass all the noisy player electronics. And so over time, it kind of evolved, and then I reached a kind of a plateau where I had set it aside for a long time, and then Simon came in and was like, oh, I want to make this capture card, and make PAL really good, so we kind of dug into it, and I kind of rewrote it so that it used the same code for NTSC and PAL. And then I had a lot more data to work with, like a lot more bad disks, so I would just keep pushing on getting bad disks to play better.
Plus, you also had a Simon calling you every other day asking you, is it done yet?
That too. And now we've got a Discord forum with tons of people, and wow.
How do you feel emotionally about the extra lines in the PAL signal?
PAL is awesome. Americans don't know what they're missing.
I do. Well, PAL Laserdisc owners didn't know what they were missing either.
Yeah. One of the interesting things is that PAL is kind of, from the perspective, especially of what we're doing with Domesday, where you've got single frames, where you're not really interested in frame rate, because frame rate is NTSC's only advantage. It's a smaller frame, but it's a much faster frame. So in Domesday, when you have still frames, NTSC is no advantage at all. But the problem is that PAL players they got to kind of the VP415, and then everyone in Europe just forgot about Laserdiscs. So when Pioneer developed Laserdisc players, they developed really, really good NTSC players, but they never developed any good PAL players. So the interesting thing about Ld Decode is that we were able to take PAL and show PAL as if it was developed in the same way that NTSC was. If Pioneer had carried on with PAL, they would have made players that could have got close to what Ld Decode can do. So if you look at a Domesday disc playing on a VP415 and the output from Ld Decode, it is miles apart. If you look at a modern Laserdisc NTSC on a modern NTSC player, it's a bit narrower. So actually the advantage from the Domesday perspective, I mean, forgetting about poor old Chad and all his movies, but the advantage from me, my selfish thing, this Domesday thing, is huge. You know, we have the best PAL Laserdisc players on the planet, all in software. And it's a massive thing in comparison to what a real player can do. The Americans, not so lucky, but it's still better.
Oh, cool.
But we have a lot of jokes in the project all the time between PAL and NTSC. Trust me on this one. I don't let anyone get off lightly.
So another question from Phil. Question with regard to contributing. Are there extracts of LD data which can be used by contributors who don't have access to Laserdiscs and capture equipment?
We've got a lot of small samples. And if you really get into it, we can arrange you to have like a whole disk worth. We can basically get you whatever you need.
If you pop on the Discord server and you ask, Chad has a very nice little G drive that has a bunch of samples that are relatively copyright free. So we can do it that way.
I've got a couple of NASA discs. Those have no copyright at all.
Yeah, exactly. So we can give you examples, PAL and NTSC examples. So jump on Discord, ask nicely, and we will provide.
Excellent. Another one. Have you considered a machine learning backend that can do image recognition across an entire disk and therefore automatically count the number of sheep?
Yes. The artificial intelligence in the product and the project has a special name. We call it Ian. And his job is counting the sheep and some scanning and stuff.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm trying to hire this one from Sesame Street, but
we have actually, I mean, there is actually, joking aside, there is actually some, within 3D comb filtering, there is this need to be able to sort of like, you can only use 3D if something is in motion. And we need to have algorithms in the 3D comb filters that spot fluid motion of the picture, to spot which bits are moving and which bits are not moving. And the not moving parts, you can only apply 2D comb filtering, which is not quite as good, but works with a single field or frame. And then for the rest of it, using 3D. But if you get it wrong and you apply 3D to a part that is in motion, you'll get an actual worse result. So we have actually been looking at using some kind of OpenCV AI and that sort of thing to do optical flow detection and motion detection within the scenery of it. So it is actually something that's practical that we've looked into in the project. I wouldn't say we got very far with it, but we have enough trouble with real intelligence, let alone artificial intelligence.
Another one. So this is Phil M. Can the system be used to preserve other analog formats?
Yes. I mean, the problem is when you say system, you can mean either the Domesday duplicator or you can mean the LD Decode. But as an example, the VHS guys, they're not using the duplicator at the moment. They're using a off-the-shelf TV capture card that can be adjusted to act as a sampler. And they use that with, I think it's a Linux driver that Chad wrote actually, that enables you to pull data natively off of it. It's not as good as a Domesday duplicator, but you can get one for, 10 quid off eBay. And that means you can then look at tape, for example.
Somebody else wrote the driver, and I just updated it to work with current Linux, and people are keeping it updated so that it still works with current Linux.
Yeah, so absolutely is the answer to that. And if there is a format and you really want to go wild on it, everything we're doing is open source. Download the code. You can fork it and modify it like the VHS guys. You can, if you want to scan clouds, you can too. I mean, it's an open project, so you can use all of the things that we've developed. You can modify them. You can contribute back or not. I mean, everything is there for you to use. Nothing is a secret. And I would say that we have pretty good documentation for everything as well, which is the other half of it. It's not enough just to have code, but there is actually a full wiki for the project where we talk about how you do things. There's even a section that one of the guys from the BBC, a friend of mine, Steve, wrote, showing how to do proper PAL encoding from what's coming off the Laserdisc and make good FFmpeg videos from it and all that sort of stuff. So we have contribution from all over the place in documentation as well as code.
So Tricky is wondering, are you using the techniques used in frame rate conversion to fill gaps, etc.?
Not yet.
No, not at the moment. So there's a couple of, a lot of this is post-process as far as I'm concerned. I mean, our job from an LD Decode perspective is to get the very best we can from a Laserdisc. Once you get into things like vapor synth and those types of processing systems, there's no need for us to do that. You can use, we produce an Rgb 48-bit stream, which is a lot of resolution, but you can just load that into FFmpeg, you can load that into VaporSynth, you can load that into Adobe Premiere Pro, whatever you like. So once we've produced what's on the disk or reproduced as accurately as possible what's on the disk, we are not attempting to do anything that is outside of that domain. So the post-processing domain, if you've got 2 bits and a gap in the middle, there are tools out there that will fill that gap using AI and all those sorts of things. That's not our problem. We're very focused on recovering all the data we can from a Laserdisc and then providing that data to the post-processing tools. Having said that, because that is our aim, we try to produce everything coming out of the LD Decode is in a standard format that other tools can use. And that goes for like the comb filters and all those techs as well, which is why you see projects like Hack TV, for example, using our comb filters, because you can plug in other projects quite easily into the tool chain that we have. So
Tricky follows up with, but haven't you lost the knowledge of what is missing by then?
Well, that's the thing. If it's possible to recover it, then it will be recovered in some way. You may get a distorted field coming out, but if it was on the Laserdisc and it's in the RF sample, then LD Decode will recover what is there. So you won't lose any information, but the post-processing tools will have to work on what is left. But we always try not to lose anything. But I mean, if the nice thing is that the output can be an MPEG-4. If you want to work from the raw PAL analog signal, that's in the tool chain as well. The tools are passing that between each other. So in the same way you saw that LD Analyze tool that's able to look at raw PAL, you can extract that raw PAL and you can put that into another tool. You can pass it back into LD Decode. So everything is kind of, we have a tool chain that has very standard ways of communicating between the tools. And then we have a JSON-based metadata format that enables every tool to add what it knows to the metadata as well. And then the downstream tools use the metadata and then the rest of it. So if Tricky, for example, wanted to insert a particular tool that was off the shelf that he knew about with AI and super things and wanted to do that at the PAL level, he could actually insert that into the tool chain at whatever point was appropriate. So it's designed to work that way.
So Walter wants to know, and I know you answered this probably in the first talk, but not everyone will have seen that. Walter wanted to know, how does the newly fixed video get reconnected into the BBC Domesday system?
We use a special technique called magic. No, the idea is this is something that we haven't done yet, or I haven't done yet. My intention is to take it and build a FPGA emulation of the VP415 that uses these beautiful signals that we're getting from Ld Decode. It uses all of the decoded metadata, and it's able to then be booted, and it will run just like a Laserdisc player ran.
But,
and then you've gone all the way around the loop, basically.
But with Pioneer quality instead of VP415 quality.
With Ld Decode quality, which is even better than Pioneer managed.
Let me just see. Right. How do you know which is the first field of a frame?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. In CAVs, if they follow the standard, then the first field is denoted by the one that has the frame number in it. So the frame number is used by the player. When you hit the pause button on the player will stop on the next field that has a frame number, and that's the first field, and then the one after is the second field. Mm-hmm. On a CLV, where there was no need to do still frames, you just don't. Usually the first frame you see is the first frame, and the second frame you see is the second frame, and it keeps that order through the disk. Apart from the disk where it doesn't.
And except for one industrial player, it will just pause on one field and show you one field twice.
So the tools basically have some extra buttons that if Ld Decode gets it wrong, you can just hit reverse the fields, please, and the tools will then work with reversed fields. So every single tool in the tool chain has a switch, and you can tell it this disk is screwed. please do things the other way around, because almost every Laserdisc has an exception from the specification. It's a total mess, but it's 1970s technology we're talking about. It's not a modern thing.
So Robert wants to know if you'll be able to share the FPGA solution given the copyright issues with the Domesday content.
We'll be able to share the design of the FPGA solution as an open hardware project, just like we do the hardware and software and everything else. I think I talked about this quite a lot in the first presentation, that as a project, we won't be able to release that because of the copyright issues. But if you have access to a Laserdisc, everything we do is completely open source. Everything we do, you can do a little bit what Robert was showing earlier on and solder together your own board. You can buy a Pioneer player. You can grab someone. You can borrow one off Ian, for example, if you're in the UK. You can get a copy of that Laserdisc. Once you've got a copy of that Laserdisc, all of the software we're talking about is free and GPLv3. So you can download it. You can decode your Domesday disc. If you really want a copy of it, Ld Decode will produce everything that's on a Domesday disc. It can decode everything. You just need to put a little bit of work in. We can't do everything for you because of copyright.
So I have another one from Phil. Does Ian ever fall asleep when counting sheep?
Ian is generally asleep unless assessed otherwise. Poor guy.
So I've got another one as well, which is, so three copies would seem to be the minimum that you're going to need for sort of, I guess, that voting method of dropout correction. Mm-hmm. Do you ever see exactly the same dropout across multiple copies of the same disc? Have you ever actually seen exactly the same chunk?
It's on 3 discs. It's actually fairly statistically likely, but we can use 64 discs, and then it becomes
but you don't have 64 copies of most things.
Well, I have a lot of copies, a lot of things. No, I mean the thing is that the more copies we have, the better everything becomes. So yes, of course, it's possible for differential dropout detection to fail.
So I mean, I can't do the stats in my head, but what is the probability of actually finding the same dropout if you've only got 3 discs?
It's pretty high, actually. I mean, it does happen, but it will be very few. If you have 4 or 5 discs, I think it becomes a lot less. But I'm not going to do the math in my head.
Yeah, well, you'll have overlaps, but there won't be that many, and it'll look
I think
a lot better.
One of the things that I'd like to do in the software at some point is to allow you to add in your own dropouts as well. So in the LD Analyze tool, for example, if you see a dropout, you can actually tell the Analyze tool to highlight all of the dropouts that are known in the metadata, and whether they're from RF detection or from differential detection. And I'd like to get to a point where you can actually see that one is missing and you can just draw it in. and it will just add it into the metadata. And once it's in the metadata, the downstream tools that do the correction will pick up on it and work perfectly. That's the advantage of having these tools and this metadata, is that if you come up with a better way of working out where the dropouts are, you just build a tool that just does that. It pulls it in, it adds its data into the metadata, doesn't have to understand anything else. So that was how we made the problem into bite-sized chunks by using this chain of different software with the metadata in between. And it means that if you are good at something like AI detection of dropouts, please come along and write some code. That's the only thing you need to understand. We'll do the rest of the work.
Oh, fantastic. So I've run out of questions that have been written or I jotted down whilst I was listening. Thank you ever so much. I've opened up the chat now so people can chat and pose questions in chat. People can also unmute themselves, pose questions by video. So I'd just really like to completely open it up and say go for it. But if no one else has anything else, you know, thank you ever so much. That was a really brilliant talk. I very much enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Any more for any more?
Simon, I think I heard you mentioning a Discord earlier in respect of Ld Decode. Is that a separate one for Ld Decode, or are you referring to the ABug chat?
No, it's the Domesday 86 Discord server. So if you go to domesday86.com and click on Contact Us, you'll see a link to our Discord server. And that's where we hang out on the Domesday side, but also just general Laserdisc decoding, because I mean, I always look at it from the perspective of Domesday, but that's really just me. Everybody else is more interested in Star Wars and all sorts of things that, you know, other nerds seem to enjoy. And there's a bunch of VHS guys there as well. Everybody is on the Discord server, basically. So feel free to join, and you'll see the links. We also have a Facebook group as well, and that's on the Contact Us page. So you'll find it all on the Domesday 86 website. The more, the merrier, especially technical guys. We love technical guys.
Cheers. I've been following the Facebook for a while, but this is the first I've heard about the Discord. So I've just joined.
Okay. Perfect.
Any more for any more? Mucho silence. Right. Okay. I think I have to now pull up, you see, the schedule. I think we can stop there. But again, thank you very much. If anyone has any more questions or anything else they'd like to discuss about this or about the Domesday project in general, you can do it now. That is entirely fine, because I believe, where is it? I'm looking at entirely the wrong page on Stardot at the moment.
Yeah,
there we are.
Another talk and a half.
There we are. We have a defined period of miscellaneous chat, which will now be miscellaneous until 10 p.m. Because I believe we're not going to have a microsoldering update anymore. So, and you can therefore go and get popcorn, drinks, refreshment breaks, comfort breaks, whatever you like. And
lunch in my case.
Lunch, you can get lunch. How is everything in California at the moment? Is it all right? Sketchy?
It's all right.
Yeah.
COVID's annoying. I would have been at Vintage Computer Festival right now if it weren't for COVID.
Mm-hmm.
It's live on YouTube.
Yeah,
what, COVID?
online,
no,
but...
the festival. Right.
Yeah.
We got Chad to do more important things than VCF. Proper
Yeah.
European stuff.
But you wouldn't have been, Chad, you wouldn't have been at this ABug, neither would I. Neither would Paul.
Exactly.
Maybe a few others. Huh?
Yeah, I mean,
I
it
remember
worked out.
talking to you at the last VCF, actually.
Yeah.
Hi from Mountain View.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Hey, Phil.
Hello there.
Yeah, so in the alternate universe, I would probably have looked at the board you're working on in person if you brought it.
Yes, I would definitely. I mean, I'm actually, here's this was my presentation from last year. Right now, it's just serving as a handy little spacer in this office home office I share with my wife. So yeah.
So Chad, what's the deal with no Acorn kit? Come on, it's not that hard to get.
He's waiting for me to send him a Doomsday system. That's what it is.
That's likely not going to happen.
Will you have you'll have a rattly box of bits by the time it gets there, won't you?
It's the carrot on the stick thing. You have to keep them hopeful until LD Decode is done.
Daniel, if you pack it like Mark at Retro Clinic does, no problem at all. That would go through a war zone.
Yeah.
Of course, not everybody does that, but I've had lots of different BBCs, Masters, RISC PCs. I haven't had any problems with them coming here and being broken, or I've had them come here and not working.
Yeah.
So far, most of them I've got working, but a couple that I haven't yet. But none of them come broken. And in the the boot it down the stairs trick, or boot it up the stairs and throw it at a doorstop, like I'm hearing that some of the couriers are doing in the UK.
Let me see if I can find you the
I've seen them already, probably, Daniel.
the video.
I was going to say, ironically, I've actually got a USA Beeb, but it's been converted back to UK market.
Yeah, there were a few USA. I don't know, Chad, whether you've seen the US model ones, but they have like inch thick RF shielding inside them. Lead lined.
Many years ago, they had them at Weird Stuff, and I didn't pick one up because, well, I didn't know at the time that I should. This was
they weigh a ton.
And have had it, kept it this long anyway if I had bought one.
Yeah.
So Ian, does your US Beeb, has it still got the shielding in it?
It's got the shielding underneath, but not the shielding on top. So it's got shielding under the main board, but it's been converted back to PAL.
Yeah, that's not that tough a job to do, is it?
Yeah.
Simon, in the event that this ends up on YouTube or other such video sharing platforms, can I just put in a quick request for a number of titles that, if anybody's who collects Laserdiscs has them? I've got 6 titles that I'm looking for personally. Can I just quickly list them?
No.
I was going to say, Daniel is the host here. I think we can only allow 3. So pick your 3 favorite ones.
You can have 4.5.
All right.
Half is the one you have to think hard about.
The first was one we produced for British Rail called Antics and Semantics. The second one is one I produced called Counterintelligence. We've got a few copies of that, but other copies would be good. The third one is disc for Coates Viella, which will be called ISES, Interactive Sales Environment System, or ISIS. The other third one is called Slips, Trips and Falls, which was developed for Shell Oil UK and was used on the oil rigs. The third one is called the Naga disc, which was produced by Alan McFarlane, the anthropologist from Cambridge. And finally, there was a generic disc that I was after for doing language learning, which is called Ensemble. It's a Learn French disc. So those are my 6 or 6.
Phil, do you want to pop those in writing as well?
Okay.
We can put them other places.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have a wanted section on the Doomsday 86 site as well. I'm quite happy to add your list of discs to it in case someone gets in touch.
Yeah, nice one.
And just drop me an email. You know where I am.
I was going to say, Phil, the British Rail discs are pressed by PDO, so there's your half a disc.
The first half might actually play.
So
I was going to say very briefly, people keep on sort of asking for once there is a FPGA implementation of the 415, sort of what to run on it. Well, now the source code is available, there's nothing stopping anyone putting a alternate Domesday disk together of all open source material, or even doing their own surrogate walks. So you could theoretically sort of put together a new Domesday disk of around a town or something like that.
Around the Center for Computing History.
Yeah.
We actually, as well as the PAL transform decoder, there is actually a PAL encoder that Adam has written. So you can actually pretty much now encode 98% of a Laserdisc if you wanted to make your own RF image. And once you did that, then you'd have a Laserdisc. You could even make it compatible with Domesday. So, I mean, you could run it on an original BBC with an emulated Laserdisc player. It would be kind of interesting. We talked about it ages ago, but it's... Sorry, Chad?
You could use Wikipedia data to fill it up.
That would be cheating.
Yeah.
you could just look at Wikipedia.
The same way the BBC did it.
Yeah.
It's a bit like when people say to me, I really want to like work out, I've got this laser disc of The Matrix, how can I watch it in really high quality? And my answer is Netflix.
I heard
Buy
that
the Blu-ray, yeah.
change the colors in the latest mastering of The Matrix.
Blah, 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 blah.
I've actually got The Matrix. I'm going to have to sample it just to double check.
It is amazing. I mean, it's like, it's an open source project. People can preserve whatever they feel they need to preserve. Yeah. But sometimes there are faster and more effective mediums.
But I mean, it comes back to what you were talking about before. It's what you need to preserve. I mean, music exists in many different formats. Is the CD of something the format that you'd actually want to preserve? Well, probably not. It's probably the master tape, actually, wherever that exists, which will exist.
Unless it was at Universal.
Fire.
Well, maybe not, because the record companies have been quite careless in some cases. And have gone to record collectors and said, "Can we get the music back off your record?"
Yeah.
But the nice thing about open preservation projects like Ld Decode and Domesday 86 is we are not the gatekeepers. If you really think that it's very important to make a copy of your Wombles disc from 1983, go right ahead. As long as it's your time and not my time, I'm not the one that controls what you use this tech for. It will work. It will do it. You just need to put the time in yourself if that's what you think is important. I mean, everybody's boat is floated by different things.
Yeah, and the tools are out there now. There are many tools for many different media formats. I only get worried when the file formats start getting mushed around. But
I'm just waiting for the day that somebody actually gets Dragon's Lair or Space Age running on a beep.
It is entirely possible.
We've had Dragon's Lair on the ZX81, for goodness sake.
Well, the thing is, if you take an AIV system and the PAL version of Dragon's Lair, which does exist, you can take the original game map for it. You could re-implement it as a copy on BBC and run it with a not quite as good as the original, but pretty close, since everything is on the Laserdisc. I mean, there's no real graphical stuff. I got my eldest to try and play Dragon's Lair at Arcade Club. It's a horrible game. And he didn't use any swear words, but I think it was like, "What is this? This is a game." I said it's one of those games that's a lot better in your head. You remember it being really good fun, and then you try to play it, and it is impossible from the first screen. I had to explain to him, actually, when I took him to Arcade Club, I said the entire basis of all of these machines is to get you to put money in them. They're not there to be finished. They're not there to be easy. They're there to be frustrating and make you want to put money in it. We all remember these games as being like these amazing things that you could complete. You pretty much can't. They're a pain in the neck. The great thing about those games, though, is I actually have 3 arcade systems downstairs, full-size arcade systems. And my kids, when they were really small, they loved them because with an arcade game, you never die. You just have to keep putting in money. Yep. And if that money is free, then you can play the game from end to end. It kept them amused for hours. Best babysitters I ever built.
Very true. At least no one accidentally traded their favourite Pokemon.
This is true. But Bubble Bobble and Pretty Soldier Sailor Moon, there were loads of arcade games, especially the Japanese ones.
Yeah.
My girls love them.
Oh, Bubble Bobble is a superb
Bubble
game.
Bobble is awesome.
I think we covered this in part 1, but Dragon's Lair is already on the Acorn systems because Jim Bagley, who did the ZX81 version, I asked him to convert it to the Atom. And
he did put it on the Atom.
Yeah. So that is actually in the Atom software archive.
Unless it has a Laserdisc player attached to it, doesn't count.
True facts. I'd like to see a teletext version of it. Where's Kieran?
When will the FPGA Genlock board be available, Simon?
Well, tomorrow if you write the software, buddy. Welcome to open source. Otherwise, when I get round to it.
I can't do hardware.
Nor could I, but then I learned. I can send you some books if you like. Hardware for dummies.
I might have just volunteered for that one.
I like it. No, I mean, you know, there's all of these different things that need to be done, and everything is open. We're not proud. If anyone wants to join in, I mean, the only reason why we ended up with PAL transform decoders is because, you know, some random guy in Scotland put his hand up and went, "Hey, I like that stuff, and I understand the maths." And Chad and I were like, "Great, because we don't." Please go ahead and write that stuff. Look at this magic. Yeah, it looks really good.
Half the reason Hack TV's got the pay-per-view encoding for the phone card interface on the Skybox is because I sat down and reverse engineered the sod.
Yeah, it's that's the beauty of it, is like, you know, you can jump in and you can jump out. But one of the things Chad and I did that I think was a very careful and good decision was we refactored everything to split up this thing into a tool chain, to break it down into bite-sized chunks that you know, you don't have to understand everything about Ld Decode to work on Ld Decode anymore. You could just understand the comb filters, or you could just understand dropout correction. And the tools, not only are the tools architected that way, but there's actually, in the C++, Qt C++ side of things, there is a TBC library that provides you with all of the basic functions for doing file format handling, for, you know, dealing with the output from Ld Decode and getting the VBI and all of that stuff. It's all in a common library. So you can actually pull half of your brain straight from the library and then just insert the other half. So I think we've tried to make it as easy as possible.
So how are you actually thinking about it? How are you identifying dropouts as at present? So you're counting dropouts. What are you using? Are you just using thresholding, or are you?
It's a rapid drop in frequency, isn't it, Chad?
Yeah, it's a rapid drop in frequency, so rapid that it goes outside any valid value that a disc could have. So if it goes super bright or super dark, it's a dropout. At one point, I'm not sure if I still do, it tries to pick up changes in the RF that look weird, like the little.
Have you? I mean, so this sounds ripe for machine learning. You just feed it a training set and just of things that you know are dropouts. I mean, it might mean that Ian has to tediously mark up several frames of
sheep dropouts. Or is that sheep droppings? I don't know.
I mean, the easy way that I've just sort of sat here with a notepad scribbling ideas down.
Yeah.
And the way that springs out to me is to look at the pixels on either side and look for, again, the threshold, it going way out of bounds. So it suddenly goes dark, suddenly goes light. If you get a dropout on black, you're not going to see it, so that's not a problem. If you get a white dropout on white, same thing. But if you look for these huge contrast shifts, not just X and Y, but also frame to frame, if you suddenly get this flash on one frame that isn't on previous or next.
Right, until someone gives you an anime Laserdisc. Yeah.
Yeah, but you see, that's a well-trained machine learning algorithm should be able to spot it in the RF.
Yeah.
Rather than the pixel levels. So it should understand what it looks like when a signal goes wonky.
And I think the great thing is that for each one of these individual problems, I mean, Chad and I, we're just two guys, and there's another guy, Adam, so 3 doing software development, and we don't know everything about everything. So in a lot of the points in the tool chain, what we've done is written something that works, and then gone, phew, and then moved on to the next bit. On certain bits that we're really good at, like Chad and his signal processing and the TBC has had massive amounts of development. And it's the same with the comb filters, lots and lots of development. The EFM stuff, no one had ever decoded EFM in software before. That was lots of development. But there are now the opportunity to focus more and more on smaller and smaller things. So I mean, that's really where it flies as it gets bigger and bigger. And the great thing is tape has dropouts too. So if one of the VHS guys, for example, decided to get interested in dropouts, that would assist us on the Ld Decode side, because it's effectively the same problem in a lot of respects. So I mean, I'm hoping that as Ld Decode gets more and more mature, we will have more and more people looking at less and less in more and more detail. And that's really what I'd like to see. I mean, I'm surprised that the take-up has been so slow, but I think a lot of that's to do with the focus on Laserdiscs. The Venn diagram of people that know how to code and know about analog television systems and that care about Laserdiscs, it's a pretty thin slice. It's like me.
It's such a fun subject, though, image analysis, because I got started in it when a lecturer at my university insisted on only using the overhead projector. So he would bring in a sheet of blank acetate, a pack of blank acetates, a bunch of pens, all the notes were on the screen. There were no PowerPoints, nothing. You had to be in there for lecture. And he wrote so bloody quickly that we couldn't keep up. So a couple of us were sat there with digital cameras recording it. And then the next thing we've got megabytes of these pictures of the overheads. And then we sort of, there's not enough hard drive space. These are hard to move. And that turned into cleaning up the image, finding the edges of the projected frame, and then quantizing it down into, he's got a red pen, a green pen, a blue pen, and a black pen. And it actually got a lovely 4-color PNG file. And we were just emailing these back and forth between us. Who's got the next slide after this one? And
that's brilliant.
Yeah.
We had a lecturer who, before you would think about doing image analysis, he took the same OHP role to each lecture, so he could just continue on from the previous lecture. And then at the end of the term, he scrolled back through it all and he said, I'm going to examine you. And there was a pause, and he scrolled back and he said, everything I've done in blue pen. And nobody had taken a note of any colours that he'd used in taking their notes. So you had to revise the whole term.
I'm not convinced that it needs image analysis. So I'm, for reasons I won't go into, looking at how speed cameras chuck out what's known as slip error. It's where you get, all of a sudden, the camera gets like an unrealistic acceleration of the car, or the distance changes too quickly. I mean,
is this a court case?
It might be.
I do recall old stories, usually making it to the tabloids, about a clapped out Ford getting done for doing like 341 miles per hour.
Yeah, but exceptions and what's the term? Sort of exceptions and bailout conditions. I mean, they're quite easy to detect. Things that are obviously anomalies. I don't know if you'd need to go to the level of AI image. Like
I think it depends on the complexity, though. If you're measuring speed, you can see these are the boundaries, and that speed needs to be in it. The problem with pictures is that dropouts are not just. Sometimes the dropout doesn't affect the luma; it affects the chroma, and so the luminosity of the image is fine, but the chroma is lost. and sometimes it affects the chroma but not the luma, and you never really know what's going to happen when you look at the signal, and you can look at it at different points of the decoding as well to try to spot different things. So it is quite a complicated problem. I know that Chad spent a lot of time just doing the RF level detection stuff, and it's not easy, which is why I did differential detection, because differential detection from a sort of mass perspective is pretty easy to understand. It's just a voting system. So, I mean, it was quick and easy, and it got around the problem that it's really bloody difficult to do.
Whereas the thing about machine learning algorithms is that they can actually detect things, other components that you wouldn't notice, which are indicators. So there are signals which you're not going to think of, which actually exist, which become quite loud in a machine learning algorithm, especially if you. But the problem is, to develop the training set, you have to actually spend a large amount of time. Either you can't rely on a training set which has been derived algorithmically, because then it will only detect the algorithm which you originally put in.
Yeah, exactly.
Play. You have to actually identify those things.
I think there's scope for all of the above, though. That's the interesting thing. There's nothing that limits us in open spare time projects. If you think that there's a good way to do it. Yeah, it's like, go for it. No one's going to tell you that's a bad. Well, actually, lots of people will tell you it's a bad idea, but you don't have to care.
Yeah,
that's the key to being an open source engineer.
I may be asking one or two deliberately leading questions here.
If a car is traveling at
if a yellow van is seen moving along the road, what are the chances?
Then on the Domesday disc, it's a British Telecom van.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say, do you think it would be possible to use the output of the differential dropout to train a machine learning?
It's possible, since that's a lot better. If you're trying to train an AI to do single source dropout detection, then you could use differential, because it will see the errors. The downside of differential detection is it doesn't spot problems with the master. So a lot of Laserdiscs were transferred from tape, and the tapes had dropouts on it, and the dropouts are in exactly the same place on every single disc because they were mastered that way. So actually, it's one of the interesting things about differential dropout detection. I actually think it's better, because my idea of a perfect output from Ld Decode is exactly what should have been on the Laserdisc according to the master. And that means if there's a dropout in the master, which RF detection will see and attempt to correct, that's wrong, because it's in the master. So therefore that dropout should be there. But it really depends on how, what's the word my wife uses, anal you are about it, which in my case is pretty high. But I mean, it's even in that case, it's a good example of where what is right is a matter of opinion. Other people don't want to see black lines on the picture. That's just wrong. Why would you ever want that? I mean,
it's for the discussion of preservation versus use, really. It's for preservation, you want exactly what you've described. You want what came off the master, but to actually use the thing, having black sparklies, here, there, and everywhere that were on the master is perhaps not the best thing.
I think the interesting thing is also there's a matter of opinion of where the preservation is. As I said in the presentation, I think the preservation is the RF image. It's the disc, warts and all. If it doesn't play, you can still make a preserved copy of it. It doesn't make any difference. You could use a scanning electron microscope to take a picture of the disc. You've still preserved it. So how you decode that is kind of how you want to represent that technology. So it's for me, when we talk about recreating the Domesday experience, I want it to be like using a Domesday system. If you seek from one frame to the next frame and they're sequentially next to each other, it should be really fast. If it's 10,000 frames away, there's a certain amount of time it takes for that slide drive to get there. And an emulator should do that too, in my opinion. But not everybody agrees with that. So it's not even really a preservation thing. It's whether it's important to the experience and understanding of using that preservation as an educational tool or an entertainment.
There's two things, aren't there? There's preservation of the information and there's preservation of the experience. And you are very much thinking about both in tandem.
Yeah.
Really.
Yes and no. I disagree with Simon a little bit. Only in as much as I understand where Simon's coming from
with regards to if it's a dropout on the master disk, because it was on the original recording that created the master disk. Fully understand that, no problem. But consider this, a classic car from the 1970s would potentially have an orange, peely, red paintwork. If you were restoring that car, would you go back to putting the orange, peely paintwork on it as it came from the factory? And that's almost like for like. So I understand what you're saying, but my gut feeling would be, surely it'd be better if we could find and get round the original dropout from the original recording before it got onto the master disc.
I would say both. I mean, to me, it's the question: if you have an axe and you replace the head, and then you replace the handle because it broke, have you still got the same axe? It really is a matter of taste, and that's why I have no problem with anyone disagreeing with me, because it doesn't matter. My opinion is what I code. And no one can tell me, it's my time, I do it whichever way I like. But if someone else comes along with a different opinion and wants to do it in a different way, what we should do is understand that we have different drivers. Whether we agree with them or understand them, it doesn't matter. As long as we don't interfere with each other, then it's fine. You can do both. You can have a switch in the software that says, give me the dropouts. It's fine. Why not? And it's the same when you talk about, like, the stuff that I'm trying to do with Domesday and how that works with the NTSC stuff and how all of the people involved in the project, and there are a lot of people involved in the project, not many people coding, but there are a lot of people that are helping us with the testing and supplying disks and setting up duplicator stations around the world. And, they all want different things. Yet we still find a way to coexist with each other and help each other out. I implement stuff that I don't need because somebody else may need it. It's that sort of thing.
I'm going to do my fish impression now. Right, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Okay, thank you. That was really great discussion. Obviously, if you look at the doomsday86.com, is it .com, Simon?
Doomsday86.com, yep.
Yeah, website, you can make donations to the project of cash or information, or both. Preferably.
Yeah, we prefer both.
Both, preferably.
Or just cash.
Or cash.